Well, good afternoon. Welcome everyone to City Daily. My name is Ash. Now, I wonder, what does it actually look like to be a Christian? What does it look like to follow Jesus? At the heart of the Christian faith is what's described as the gospel or the good news. The good news that though I have done wrong, I've turned away from God, I have rebelled against Him, deserving of punishment, of eternal torment and separation from God. Actually, God Himself has stepped in, and Jesus has lived a life that I could never live, lived a perfect life, and He's freely given Himself, He's freely sacrificed Himself and His life so that the punishment for my wrongdoing could be paid and that my separation from God could be turned into rich and deep, eternal, loving relationship. And that all comes through trusting in Him, trusting that He has done what He has said He has done. That's the way in. That's how one becomes a Christian, by trusting in Jesus. But well, what then? What is it? What does it actually look like to follow Jesus? Well, there are some words from the Bible which might be quite helpful for us in that regard. They come in Philippians, a letter written by a church in Philippi. It's Philippians 2 and verses 12 and 13, which say this: Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for His good pleasure. And I find those verses really, really helpful when considering what it looks like, not only to know Jesus, but to follow Him as well. And I think we what we have there is the reality that for the Christian, the follower of Jesus, God Himself lives in you and God is transforming you. You are becoming more and more like Jesus every day. And that's an amazing thing, isn't it? It's an amazing encouragement to know that God Himself is kind of renovating us from the inside out. And there will be a day, well, we're going to increasingly look more and more like Jesus. So that ought to be an encouragement. But the reality is oftentimes the way that God transforms us, the way that He makes us more like Jesus, involves our activity, it involves our cooperation. So it's actually as we actively seek to live like Jesus and to follow Him, that God helps, God brings transformation through, that channel or that means. Which means really, for the Christian, the follower of Jesus, we ought to give attention to not only what Jesus has done on the cross, dying on a cross and rising to life again, but we ought to give consideration to how He lived. So what was it that Jesus gave His time to? What were His priorities? Interesting enough, my son and I were recently reading through the Word for Word Bible comic, which is a fantastic publication. And this one was based on Mark's Gospel, Mark's account of the life of Jesus. And as we flick through the pages, my son was mesmerized by all the pictures, and we noticed as we went through, it seemed like Jesus was always eating. It's like every second page he's having a meal with a group of people. And it's actually clear in the Bible that Jesus gives a lot of time to people. He spends time eating with people, he spends time partying with people, he spends time walking with people, he spends time talking with people. So people are clearly a really big priority in his life, him loving and serving people. But it's also clear from the Bible that Jesus spends a considerable amount of time with his Heavenly Father, with God, spends a considerable amount of time in prayer. The Bible will often talk about Jesus slipping off to desolate places to pray, and often overnight. So it seems like the priorities in his life were loving God and loving people. And I find that a really helpful framework for the Christian, just to consider. If I look at myself, if I look at my diary, my calendar, if I look at my bank statements, how far do they reflect the priorities of loving God and loving people? And that's not to be a kind of a thing that ought to bring condemnation, but just a really helpful challenge and provocation. There are many things in life that we can consider to be important and we can put a lot of weight on. But I believe that for the Christian, the follower of Jesus, we ought to be always having it in our minds. How am I loving God and how am I loving people? And how can I line my life up in such a way that those two things are priorities? And that's just what I want to leave with you guys for today. Two simple but maybe not easy things, but really important for us to consider. You know what it actually looks like for us to not only know Jesus but to follow Him. So I hope that's helpful, guys. City Daily will be back same time tomorrow. See you soon.